Hi, welcome to Policy Alternatives for Resilient Heritage in the Sunshine State. This is a great opportunity for us to tell you a little bit about one state's forward-looking approach to how to address issues of climate change, sea level rise, and disaster resilience. Joining me today, Lisa Craig, that is, with the Craig Group, is Angela Shadell, who is Vice President of Community Resilience for Taylor Engineering, and Tom Schofield, who is the Principal Planner and Historic Preservation Specialist from Pinellas County Planning Division. So we're going to be talking about a number of items, some information regarding what climate risk is, strategies for adaptation and mitigation. Public policy is the theme, so we'll be addressing some public policy initiatives in place at both the state and local level in Florida. We'll be looking at prevention, which is one of the FEMA recognized alternatives in hazard mitigation planning, and those would include everything from land use policy to financial incentives, again, very much policy related. Integrating state and local planning is critical, so how historic and cultural resources fit into that, and through some case studies in Florida, we'll be reviewing how communities have incorporated the policy issues into climate resilience planning. And then a few takeaways for those of you interested in getting your own start in this effort in climate and disaster resilience planning. So there is no doubt that we have seen some dramatic changes. Climate change has impacted many areas of our country. Whether we're looking at wildfires in the West or we're looking at tornadoes and severe storm events, hurricanes in the Southeast, high wind events, derechos in the Midwest, and all the way to the Northeast coast. This is just 2021 events, and we see that this continues into 2022. We know that there are going to be future needs for understanding adaptation and mitigation in light of these major climate change events. So let's talk a little bit about how we differentiate those terms. Adaptation is really about how we live with natural hazards. Some of us may be in the historic preservation field familiar with the concept of elevating buildings. That is an adaptation strategy. Mitigation, however, is about taking actions to reduce risk to people and infrastructure. And so that's another aspect in terms of what can be done to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases on our community. And as we all know, the greenest building is the one that already exists. So mitigation is also another aspect of historic preservation. Communities and property owners often combine these two together to manage hazards and exposure and to address issues of vulnerability through mitigation planning and policy and public awareness. So Florida has significant numbers of historic resources risk from sea level rise. As you can see, this is something that was provided by the Florida Division of Historical Resources way back in 2013. Likely, we know these numbers have increased since that time, but we are looking at thousands, tens of thousands of historic resources now at risk, along with significant archaeological sites in both the 1 meter or 3 foot 3 inches of sea level rise, or the 2 meters, 6 feet, 6 inches, almost 7 inches of sea level rise. So we will be seeing continued threats in the Southeast, particularly in Florida, as we move forward in the future. And historic and cultural resources will need to adapt. This last slide I want to talk about is really how we reduce risk. Integrating planning efforts, whether it's the comprehensive plan, your local preservation plan, hazard mitigation planning, parks and recreation plans, conservation plans, adaptation or climate risk plans, all of these need to incorporate historic resources to protect those assets, but they also need to work very closely together. So we all begin with identifying the initial risk to our historic assets. Then we look at opportunities in zoning and in building codes to adapt those resources still while being sensitive to their historic character. We need to communicate risk to property owners of those historic properties or the larger historic community. We need to have the basics, some evacuation plans for Main Street areas, for heritage sites. We need to look at ways to store water. And we need to look at ways to create barriers, levees, and flood walls that might appropriately work in certain historic areas. Then we get down to the individual homeowner or business level. What are you doing with your historic building to better reduce risk of flooding? Do you have adequate insurance? And whatever remaining residual risk is out there, you have addressed by dealing with these all of these other policy and adaptation approaches first. Now I'll turn it over to Angela to give us additional information and perspective.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So as a coastal engineer working here in my home state of Jacksonville, Florida, I've had the opportunity to work with Lisa Craig for the last 10 years, and I really appreciate everything that she's done with historic preservation. And the reason she has added me to her team is because I get to look at assessing what those risks are. So some recent work we've done is for the city of St. Augustine here in Northeast Florida, where we've looked at different flood events and done some vulnerability assessments as well as adaptation planning for the historic resources there. The picture you see here on the left is historic City Hall in St. Augustine with a sunny day flood event, which unfortunately is happening more and more. And I'll talk about what we're looking at with planning, how we assess these risks, and then what the state of Florida is doing in terms of policy. So it's interesting when we look at coastal flooding, you know, we're seeing these excessive rainfall events or flash flood events that are happening more regularly. Some sunny day flooding, as is shown in the picture, where it just happens to be an excessively high tide at certain times of year when that happens, and it just causes the roads to flood with the water coming up through the gravity stormwater drains. Storm surge is one of those big events that in hurricane season we're all very aware of and can be predicted, and we can look out and see that hurricane coming across the ocean and have an idea of what that surge will be. And then sea level rise is kind of a long-term stressor that's been increasing over time. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about just specifically in St. Augustine. Oh, you can go back one, Lisa, where Lisa and I have recently done our work. So we finished up our study of resilient heritage in the city of St. Augustine. And right after we finished our report, the client sent me these two pictures, and it was just very eye-opening of this is the motivation of why we do these vulnerability assessments, to identify risk. I mean, we identified that this area right here downtown, the picture on the left is right in front of the fort at Castillo de San Marco that's downtown St. Augustine, if you're familiar. And the picture in the center is actually a historic seawall that is on the left, and my company, Taylor Engineering, had built a new higher seawall on the right. What you're seeing is this wasn't any type of big storm surge event. It just happened to be 3 inches of rain, nor'easter winds, and it also happened to happen, it occurred at the perigean spring tide, so that the king tides are highest high tides of the year. What's really neat is the city is proactive on these things. So they actually have a flooding online tool. And so you can see on the right, that's just some graphics of where citizen science was taking pictures and posting, hey, it was flooding on my street, or here's where my car was flooded. And they received 42 reports just in that about 2.5 day period of flooding. So it's definitely very important to think about, where to help the cities understand where the flooding is coming from, what's causing it, before we can figure out, what is vulnerable and then how to plan for it. So if you go to the next slide, there was another flood event. This one happened exactly a week later after the one in the previous slide. Once again, my client was sending me pictures. I was driving in the middle of this one. This was just a crazy rain event. I mean, if you know rainfall, 5 inches in 8 hours is a lot, even in Florida. I mean, it felt like a monsoon. And you can see that's the police officer blocking off the road into historic downtown St. Augustine. And once again, this was another high tide event. And what you see here is now a storm surge event. So I've just talked about, a flash flood. And then, I talked about a king tide event. And now here you're looking at, 2 significant hurricanes back to back in 2016 and 2017 that affected the city of St. Augustine. What's interesting about these is that historic seawall that we had done a higher wall to protect the historic seawall on it, that was built in 2014. And what's interesting about it is we built it to the 7-foot NAVD 88 datum, which happens to be the 100-year or the 1% annual chance storm surge happens to occur there. And if you look at, you can see the graphics there on the third column is that both Matthew and Irma actually crested right at that kind of 7-foot NAVD 88. So the wall did work as designed. It reduced flooding impacts. But it's ironic now, the picture that I showed you from just 2 years ago was that the water was once again coming up through the gravity drains coming up through the stormwater. So if you go on to the next slide, I want to talk about just what happens to the economy, the heritage tourism within City of St. Augustine. The report that Lisa and I did, we had Don Ripkema from Place Economics come and do a assessment on what is the value of heritage in St. Augustine. And he used this very unique travel cost method. It's typically used for costing out the value of natural environmental resources. And you're looking at what is the price of that someone would travel from an area to this historic area to visit. Where are they originating from? How long are they staying? How much money are they spending? And just looking at what happens to essentially the tourism economics in a flood event. And you can see the value of heritage in St. Augustine. He computed to almost $3 billion, which has been a great benefit to the city because the City of St. Augustine, their chief resilience officer, recently applied for 11 grants and was able to get many millions of dollars using this as to say, we have this $3 billion heritage tourism that if we're not able to access it, then that the city really suffers, as do the jobs and the people. So if you go to the next slide, I really want to talk about what we discovered during this study. We talked to the National Park Service and we were able to get daily ticket counts. So just as people were walking in, how many people walked in to the National Park Service's fort. And we had daily attendance for about a 5-year period. The graphic on the left is showing the blue is kind of what the attendance looks like. So it tends to be peak upon a weekend or during a holiday. In this case, it was going to be Columbus Day that was going to peak on. And the orange is actually what happened with Hurricane Irma in 2017. The hurricane happened. It was actually announced at that first blue vertical line. It occurred during that second vertical line. You could see the steep drop off in attendance of people attending the monument. But then after the hurricane, you can see it takes almost a month for the actual attendance to recover to the level that it was. So if you think about in terms of any heritage tourism in your city or municipality, you've got issues if you know that you've got restaurants and hotels and your parking meters, you're expecting those revenues, and then you have a storm event. And if you're not prepared for it or you can't be resilient and recover really quickly, you'll have some issues. So go to the next slide. As an engineer, I can't ever talk about sea level rise and not show you a big graphic. So what you're seeing on the y-axis is global mean sea level since the 1880s. And on the bottom, it's dates from 1880 until 2020. And what I want you to see is that red line there is just showing the trend of mean sea level globally over the past 140 years. And what we're seeing is that the trend has more than doubled just in the last 20 years. We're just seeing a huge acceleration. And this is just taking data from all over the world and compiling it. And we're seeing this all along the coast. What's happening with sea level rise, though, is it's exacerbating these events like storm surge or king tides or flash floods because our gravity-driven sewer system, storm sewer, just can't really feed out like it needs to. The next slide is really pertinent to Florida. And as a fifth-generation Florida native, I find it shocking, but at the same time, it's history, right? So the graphic on the left is just in geologic time, 120,000 years ago, sea level was 20 feet higher. We know this because that green outline, we can find, megalodon shark's teeth up in some of the creeks that are inland in Florida now. So we know that there are historic beaches there. But then if you go to the middle graphic, 18,000 years ago during the last ice age, when there was more water up in the ice caps above the land, you can see the sea level was 420 feet lower. And you can actually see that big shelf that Florida was, and there's Florida today. So this isn't unheard of. We've been, much higher than we are now and much lower than we are now. It's definitely just a trend that we're having more sea level rise currently. So you might ask, what's the state doing about it? Well, the state of Florida actually has a very robust resilience program. In 2020, the legislature, with bipartisan support, passed this study. Essentially, the legislation said that any state-funded major construction along the coast has to look at sea level rise, and they have to do a sea level impact projection study on that state-funded construction. My company at Taylor was honored with the state asked me to help essentially take the coastal engineering brains at my company and put it into this, and we created an algorithm that now outputs a very simple but robust tool that shows different adaptation strategies and kind of what the impact of sea level rise would be on these construction sites. So this is a publicly available website, FDEP SLIP. The next slide will show you other interesting legislation that the state of Florida has done. So predating SLIP in 2015, we had the peril of flood, but also just this past year, we had the Resilient Florida bill. This was actually passed unanimously through both the Senate and the House, which is kind of unheard of in Florida when it comes to talking about resilience and sea level rise. But it provided $520 million in grant funding for the state, which is a huge amount of money. What that funding provides is money for vulnerability assessments, for looking at what is really vulnerable, and for implementations, those adaptation or mitigation planning like Lisa talked about. And the graphic I have in the orange and the number 4 on the bottom right shows that one of the critical assets that the state is focused on that they will provide funding for is historical resources. So if you happen to be in the state of Florida and you're a historic preservation planner, know that Resilient Florida grants are available to you to help protect critical assets. And the state does see natural, cultural, and historic resources as very important. Similarly, in 2015, we had a peril of flood statute. We call it peril of flood because it required all coastal governments to look at what is the peril of flood and actually write within their comprehensive planning what is going to occur in the future with high tide, storm surge, flash floods, and sea level rise. Mapping is required, and they have to look at, what does it look like in terms of the city or the county's planning in the future, and how will sea level rise affect it? So it was pretty progressive that it was 7 years ago when we necessarily didn't have a governor that was excited about this, but we had some planning staff that was excited about it. And then similarly, we had some adaptation action areas, which is on the next slide. And the AAAs, we call them, was created in legislature even prior to 2015, back in 2011. And it is a designation within the comprehensive plan that allows all coastal communities to essentially set aside like a special area to prioritize funding for resilience. And the graphic on the right, you can see Lisa and I just did a study for the city of Fort Lauderdale. And they, back in 2013, had did a pilot study on adaptation action areas. And all the areas in gray there happen to be the adaptation action areas. And all those dots are different projects that they are currently looking at funding with their capital improvements plan. And you can't really see it in the graphic, but we looked at historic resources specifically. And in the pink and the green in the center of the screen in some of the historic districts, they're actually going to be putting a lot of funding into some capital improvements that directly impact the historic areas. So it's just, it warms my heart to know that, this legislation started, back in 2011, and we've progressed to the point where now they're actually putting a lot of funding behind it. So it's nice to know that Florida is on the front side of this and we're leading the way. And then in closing, I just wanted to show some, collaboratives. I think intergovernmental cooperation is so important with this, and Lisa will talk more about this with planning, but, what we're seeing emerge is the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact, which came out with unified sea level rise projections for the 4 counties in South Florida. But we're also seeing other ones, Southwest, Tampa Bay, East Central, and Northeast Florida, where you're looking at, 5 or 7 counties and, up to 50 cities are getting together and saying, hey, let's pool our resources and apply for these grants together, or let's do sea level rise planning and adaptation all on the same scale. So I think collaboration is a really good way to advance the science and sea level rise and resilience planning. And then finally, the takeaways that I have are just, for the national audience, I know everyone listening isn't from Florida, but make sure you're collaborating across those jurisdictional boundaries. I mean, coastal flooding doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't say, oh, there's a county line, I'm going to stop there. Make sure you're talking to all the municipalities and the counties and other regional entities. We find that historic preservation planners, they learn a lot from each other. And sometimes the county can really help the city, and maybe they have different pots of money they're looking at. Conducting a vulnerability assessment is a really good way of understanding what are the risks of flooding and what are the assets that are vulnerable. Then looking at how do you prioritize assets? Which ones should we adapt? Which ones should we mitigate? And which ones might we have to retreat? And then looking at the grant opportunities. There are a lot on the national scale. I know Lisa's going to talk about this a little bit more, and Tom will cover some of the stuff they're doing in Pinellas County. But then specifically in Florida, if you're in Florida, reach out to a consultant about Resilient Florida Grant Program, or just Google it. Thanks for listening. Now I'd like to introduce Tom Schofield, who's the Historic Preservation Specialist for Pinellas County.
Thank you, Angela. Appreciate it. And just a quick sidebar, as we are recording this session, the trajectory of a tropical depression in the Caribbean is headed for the west coast of Florida. So by the time this is broadcast, we'll have known the outcome of that. But, I've already received that Emergency Operations Center notice saying, hey, logistics team, which I'm a part of as a planner, saying, be ready. Here we go. So we'll see how that all moves forward at time unfolds this year. Pinellas County, this being a place-based conference that the National Trust is holding. Pinellas is a peninsula on a peninsula. We are in the Tampa Bay region. We are a peninsular feature on the west coast of Florida in Tampa Bay. The city you might recognize in Pinellas County is St. Petersburg, or the city of Clearwater. We're renowned for our beaches. Pinellas is the Spanish word for Pinals, which is pine lands. The Spanish, as they were documenting the Florida coastline, mentioned pine lands as they were entering Tampa Bay in their documentation of the bay. We were established in 1912. We're not the youngest state in Florida, but by far we are not the oldest either. We are 280 square miles. We are the second smallest in area in the state of Florida. We have 588 miles of coastline, and that's every edge of the barrier island, every bay, cove along our coastline. And we are one of 35 coastal counties, so we've got a lot of coastline to manage. We are the sixth most populous county in Florida, approaching 1 million people as per the 2020 census. We are also the densest populated county in the state of Florida, in the southeast. In fact, we are built out. There are no rural areas in Pinellas County. We are built out kind of the county boundaries. We have a 0.4% population growth. So for a state that is growing so fast, we are the second slowest growing county, but that's because we're built out. We rely heavily on the tourism industry. We've had 15.2 million visitors in 2019, which broke records. We are on track here in 2022 to break that record set back in 2019. People enjoy and are visiting Pinellas on a regular basis, and that includes heritage tourism as part of our offerings. Our average age, you think Florida's full of old people. Well, we're not the oldest county, but we have the average age of 48.8. In Florida, 42.2, and that's above the national average. Delving into historic resources, I'd like you to pay attention to the blue dots on this GIS map on the left side. These are what we've documented over the past 50 years since there's been a state historic preservation office, since we've had a Florida master site file, our statewide inventory of historic resources that we rely on the Florida Division of Historical Resources to maintain for us. Within those resources, like all counties, the majority, the lion's share, are structures, just over 13,000 structures documented, 485 archaeological sites, 81 bridges, 43 cemeteries, and 104 resource groups, such things as roadways, train right-of-ways, and the like. Designated resources, I'm surprised to find that well over 50% of our inventory are designated, documented historic resources listed on the National Register of Historic Places or locally designated by one of our 7 certified local governments. We have 7 certified local governments in our county. That includes 1 National Historic Landmark and a variety of historic districts. The lion's share of our designated historic properties are contributing properties in historic districts. Next slide. So I want to share with you some of our challenges that we're facing here in Pinellas County. Some don't see it as an issue. Like every issue, there's 2 sides to every coin. One way we can look at it is local government fragmentation. We have 24 jurisdictions. It becomes at times a herding the cats exercise when you're dealing with 24 jurisdictions. This is the seals and logos of all of our jurisdictions in Pinellas County. Next slide. Also, here's a GIS map. If you notice that sky blue area, in Florida, we're one of those states where the county takes over responsibility in unincorporated areas. If you're not a municipality, the county acts and behaves kind of like the 25th municipality in Pinellas County. We have our own zoning ordinance. We implement building code regulations. We offer and have to regulate every area in Pinellas County that is not part of the municipality. So we're, in a way, the 25th municipality in a lot of our responsibilities. And here's a list of our municipalities. Those highlighted in bold and with an asterisk are our certified local governments. You see St. Petersburg, Dunedin, Tarpon Springs, Gulfport, St. Pete Beach, and Bel Air. those are the partners the county is starting with in terms of, they've demonstrated a commitment at the local level to historic preservation, and will be partnering with our certified local governments as this unfolds, this new program we're introducing. The second challenge we face in Pinellas County. So the University of Florida did a statewide study of the mid-century historical period. It is defined as the period 1945 to 1975. This represents in Pinellas County so many historical resources. So now you see the same map again on the left-hand side. I want you to pay attention to the red dots this time. The red dots represent the structures that are unsurveyed. And I did a little bit of quick math on here. We have 202,000 structures built before 1976. If you'll recall my previous slide, we thought we were doing pretty good, having surveyed over 13,000 in the past 50 years. Well, guess what? We've got a heck of a number to structures left to survey. If we're to follow our commitment as a certified local government, we are to pay attention and survey buildings 50 years of age or older. That in Pinellas County represents 189,000 plus structures that were qualify for survey. I attended a Florida Trust for Historic Preservation conference a few years ago. Ruben Acosta from the Florida Division of Historical Resources, whose responsibility is the Florida Master Site File, he told us statewide there are currently 230,000 plus resources statewide. We have to survey almost that much in Pinellas County alone in order to catch up. Also, when you begin looking at the past surveys we've done, we've averaged since about 1989, we've averaged about 400 structures surveyed, and that's DOT surveys, that's local municipalities looking at downtown areas, historic neighborhoods, and the like. So if we keep going at that average, it'll take 473 years to complete our backlog. Well, that's not going to cut it, is it? Also, at a rate of completing a master site file of $150 per master site file, it would cost us $23 million to survey 189,000 structures. Well, as you know, I don't think anybody in our local government's going to pony up that kind of cash to do a survey. It is a time for a new methodology, and I'll talk about more of that in a minute. Our third challenge, we are a coastal county. We have flood risk. That flood risk comes from storm events, sea level rise that we're facing, and that sunny day king tide that Angela was talking about. We have those issues in our communities as well here in Pinellas County. Here's what I call the scary slide. These are images taken from our local mitigation strategy, that document we prepare collectively for FEMA. The county and its 24 municipalities got together, and here's an opportunity for us to have dialogue and conversation and collaboration when we prepare our local mitigation strategy and update our local mitigation strategy. All of us are talking as communities together as we prepare this document. As you can see, our high risk includes floods, severe storm events, and tropical storms. Makes sense, right? Also in that fine print there, if you notice, NOAA came out this year, 2022. Hey, Tampa Bay, you need to be paying attention to the fact that you'll have roughly 11 to 31 inches of sea level rise by 2050. So we need to be not looking at the low or intermediate. We need to be looking at intermediate, high to high in terms of what the science is telling us. And as planners, we're definitely looking at the high end of these sea level rise scenarios, just based on what the science is telling us over the past few years. If you could go back, Lisa, real quick, I just want to point out the two images there from our local mitigation strategy. The image on the left is sea level rise by 2100. The Pinellas County becomes no longer a peninsula on a peninsula, it becomes an archipelagos along the peninsula. And you can see a Category 5 storm event at king tide. At the worst scenario, high tide, that image on the right, one of these could hit us this or next year. So this is a very real peril flood, as Angela mentions, and as the Florida legislation requires us to look at. And as you can see, that storm surge over Pinellas County touches a whole lot of the county. There's not much of the county that's untouched in a storm surge event with a Cat 5 type storm like Hurricane Michael was in the Florida Panhandle. So let's talk about, we've identified some issues. Let's begin talking about some of the solutions we're looking at here in Pinellas County. We have the Florida Master Site File. It's been around since, the 1970s. It's not a list of designated significant historic resources. It's more like the phone book, I'm dating myself using an old analogy, but everybody's phone number is in the phone book, right? So every historic resource looked at and documented doesn't mean it's significant. That's why we look at those designations as they're significant. If you remember that previous slide, 56% of our Florida Master Site File inventory is deemed significant. So we rely heavily on the state and the Florida Master Site File, but there's certain aspects of the Master Site File that just are not meeting our local needs. So it's time for us to look at having, and actually we have codified in the Pinellas County Code a county wide inventory, and it's referred to as the Pinellas Register of Historic Resources. So here is an opportunity for us to create a countywide inventory for the 24 municipalities and the county to be looking at our historic resources collectively, to have that data at our fingertips. And in the event of a storm event, have that information available on tablets, on phones, as those recovery teams go into the field after kind of the damage is done and those storm waters recede. So we have just begun developing the Pinellas Register of Historic Resources. Our contractor in the University of Florida to provide that for us, and it will contain a lot more data than the Master Site File, but will also be hopefully seamless with the Master Site File. So we're just embarking on this local inventory, but intend to make it seamless with our statewide inventory, and that's something we're endeavoring, and we'll be working and coordinating with our emergency management department, our resiliency office, to make this data in a GIS, in a geodatabase format available to anyone who wants to look at it, except archaeological resources. I have to throw that in. That is specialized information that is for certain eyes only. We don't want looting of archaeological sites. We do not, in the state of Florida, publish locational information on archaeological sites, but everything else, historic buildings, historic sites, that sort of thing, can be available to the general public, to our municipalities, as a resource tool. Something else we're looking at, with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, on the left-hand side, the county is, with its cities, are beginning to look at the idea of legacy businesses. I know several cities across the nation are looking at the issue of legacy businesses. Here are three that we have lost to COVID-19 in the pandemic. We have a beloved used bookstore that's been open for well over 50 years. The family has not opened the doors since the COVID pandemic and the shutdown. That is a beloved building and a historic building. In that middle slide, you see Biff's Burgers. If you know, in the Southeast, Biff Burgers was a franchise, a hamburger chain in the early 1960s, kind of survived into the 70s, had 70 outlets, at 70 plus outlets at one point. Biff stands for Best in Fast Food. What franchise architecture still remains? I mean, it is so, it is immediately gone when that franchise changes their image, their appearance, their brand, or goes out of business and that site is cleared. A couple came in and reoccupied this Biff Burgers, but they just couldn't handle the closing during the shutdown during COVID, and they could not reopen. So right now, our interesting little franchise building down in the St. Petersburg area is kind of vulnerable because it's closed and not available. Also, when you begin looking at some of these more esoteric resources, things like the Wagon Wheel Flea Market in the Pinellas Park area, which is kind of south central Pinellas County, we lost the flea market. The family decided they have 30 acres, and when you begin looking at 30 acres in, sorry about that background noise, I didn't shut my cell phone off. 38 acres of undeveloped land, which a flea market basically is, they decided we can't open, and there was a huge produce section to that flea market. That produce market just closed up, and when I attended before COVID hit, that produce market had the most interesting produce, stuff I've never seen before in my life. Now it's kind of a produce desert with that flea market closing. Those produce vendors gone off to other locations. So we begin looking at historic resources a little bit differently. How would I record this on the master site file? Well, a little bit esoteric in something like a flea market area. But we want to understand kind of these beloved legacy small businesses in a way that's a little bit different than how we've been doing historic resource inventories in the past. So that's some of the challenges we're facing in Pinellas County. Also, as Angela mentioned, we have that Resilient Florida legislation here that we can take advantage of in Florida. We've got to begin looking at locally, what are we going to be calling our critical historic assets? That's 7,600 plus buildings listed on the National Register. Well, a local government may not deem that a critical historical asset. Every single one of those 7,600 buildings may not be deemed, and sites may not be deemed as critical assets. So we want to begin kind of developing a methodology on what, can be considered historical asset, either publicly or privately owned. And I have 3 examples here. The Don Cesar Hotel in St. Pete Beach. It's right on the beach. It's one of our beautiful Mediterranean revival structures. It's already listed in the National Register. It is an economic engine for that city, the city of St. Pete Beach. Also, that second slide, you look at the Greektown district. That's a slide with sunny day flooding. No one wants to drive their car. That's brackish water. No one wants to drive down a street with salt water affecting their car in it. So just like Angela had that great graphic in St. Augustine that shows kind of a shutdown from sunny day flooding or a tropical storm or a hurricane event, this community is shut down as long as Dodecanese Boulevard, that main access artery into the Sponge Docks district, is suffering from sunny day flooding. And each year we see more and more days that are sunny day flooding. And also something as esoteric as an archaeological site. This is a county, this is our National Historic Landmark. It is a temple mound on the Tampa Bay shoreline. We've got high visitation at the park. This is one of the critical cultural resources that is one of those park amenities. The county owns it. It is on a shoreline. We've got to start looking at sea level rise and the impact on our National Historic Landmark. So it's a little bit different, but definitely we can consider it a critical asset and part of our economy and part of those assets that we value here in Pinellas County. So that gives you some ideas of some of the things we're beginning to look at. A second solution is a new historic structure survey methodology. How do we survey those 189,000 structures that were built before 1976? Well, what we're doing is we're parsing the data. We're basically, I'm not going to read every one of these steps in the slide, but we're working with the Florida Master Site File in the state to develop a methodology, a windshield survey methodology. Some of you in other states may have kind of a reconnaissance or windshield survey methodology that you use regularly. Here in Florida, that's not been actively used, but the state's now beginning to recognize after Hurricane Michael, when cities like Mexico Beach were wiped out and there were not Florida Master Site Files for any of those buildings that are now gone after a Category 5 storm event, the state staff realizes that, hey, if we get some fields of data and a photo into an inventory, we're that much further ahead. So we're beginning the idea of a windshield, descending upon our neighborhoods here in Pinellas County, doing windshield survey, just to get data into our local inventory and eventually into that statewide inventory. But heaven forbid, should a Cat 5 hit Pinellas County, buildings are removed, are demolished, are disappeared, we will have a record of what those buildings have once stood there. Once we get into this, we're not well into this yet, and hopefully, let's hope that tropical depression in the Caribbean's not doesn't turn into a Cat 5, because it won't be not too good a shape in that regard. But this methodology that talks about having that inventory in our hands at the local level that can be used for deployment after during recovery after a storm event. And we're not quite there yet, but we're working towards that. In the left slide, again, there's a GIS map that shows you kind of all those red dots in the flood zone areas. These are areas that we're focusing on, working with our 6 municipal CLGs in inventorying those neighborhoods in the special flood hazard area. Basically about 9 feet above sea level is what that translates into here in Florida, at least in our region. And we are kind of stratifying this. We're also looking at low to moderate income neighborhoods. So we're starting with structures in the special flood hazard area, and then we add that additional layer. And so we reduce that 189,000 structures to about 55,000 structures. Still kind of a yeoman's task to take on, but at least that number is reduced, and we can prioritize. It's kind of a triage approach to doing survey. Also, it is so important to not just go out there on the street and we have a phone app that University of Florida is sharing with us that we can kind of click, walk down the street. That archival research, talking to the generational families that live in these neighborhoods is so important. You look on the right-hand slide, you think I kind of referred to this type of architecture as mid-century, meh. But the story, that's why it's so important to do the archival analysis behind these buildings. An African-American doctor decided he was going to build his office outside of the Red Line District in St. Petersburg. So you see that single-story building on the right in this photograph, that's where he built his office. 2 years later, when Major League Baseball started to come to Florida for spring training, and the African-American players could not stay with the white players in the hotel, he built 6 apartments on site, and that's what you see in this 2-story building on the left-hand side. Those are apartments for Major League Baseball players to stay in when they were down here for spring training. Wonderful story, and we just would not have known that story if we hadn't done that archival and talking with the family research. And so we can never, kind of jettison the whole idea of doing that important historical background research on these properties. Next slide. All right, solution number 3. We are developing a countywide flood mitigation strategy. Just like how we have 189,000 historic buildings or structures to survey, we've got a whole lot of area to do a flood mitigation strategy, and we're starting in. And as Angela mentioned, floodwaters know no municipal boundary, no boundaries. They don't care if there's a municipal boundary there or not. So the counties join with our municipalities on this flood mitigation strategy. And we're looking at things like watershed. This is a planning approach by watershed. We'll be looking at 5 pilot project areas that are watersheds in our county to begin looking at a flood mitigation strategy, at those adaptation strategies Angela mentioned. We're a couple of years behind communities like Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, St. Augustine, and some of our planning. But, we understand that we need to get into this. So our countywide flood mitigation strategies approach we're taking, and at least beginning in areas from a watershed perspective and looking at the effects of floodwater, develop water modeling tools and techniques that we can adapt and demonstrate to the general public, to planners and municipalities, to property owners, what the effect of sea level rise and floodwaters have on properties district-wide. This flood visualization software, if you can envision a Google car driving up and down the street, well, we're going to have a terrestrial LiDAR scanner on top of a car that drives up and down every street in special flood hazard area in Pinellas County. That's basically going to create terabytes of information, a point cloud you apply to that structural imagery that gives you a feel for what the community looks like. And then you add that flood visualization software that shows you sea level rise or a category storm event and what it looks like. And you begin, it really assists and aids in planning. And we will have that for special flood hazard areas in 2 years' time for Pinellas County. Angela mentioned the critical assets we need to be looking at. That class 4 of critical assets includes historical and cultural assets. We are embarking with our municipalities and neighborhoods and communities with what do you see as those critical assets. Lisa Craig's done some great work in Tarpon Springs already, getting out of the gate on this conversation. Identify those adaptation action areas and adaptation strategies. Well, when you look at the sponge dock in Tarpon Springs, retreat does not mean you have to relocate. or an adaptation strategy is not really retreat. If you move to the high dry land along US 19 in Pinellas County, well, you don't really have sponge docks with boats anymore. We have to have a different adaptation strategy for some of our historic districts and our historic resources. So these adaptation strategies may look a little different than some of the other adaptation strategies being pondered. Also, the vulnerability assessments. In Florida, we are really wrapping our heads around these vulnerability assessments. And in order to qualify to use Resilient Florida money, critical historical and cultural assets have to be in your vulnerability assessment. That is a key tie to this whole program. And then the whole idea of projects list and a funding strategy for what we do to look at all of our critical assets, hospitals, roadways, bridges, and those historical assets that are important to our local heritage tourism economy. So important to wrap our heads around. This slide, I want to, for our audience, please check out the University of Florida's Envision Cedar Key. This is available if you do a Google search for Envision Cedar Key. You will find they've got a great Esri story map on what they've done in downtown Cedar Key, and you will see some visualization that looks like actual floodwaters coming down the streets of Cedar Key. It is all virtual and digital in this creation. It is a great story map that I encourage you to take a look at. And there's a hot link here to that, but just Google Envision Cedar Key in that University of Florida product. This is an example of what we want to do countywide in our special flood hazard areas. A small example of what we want to do on a much grander scale, but wanted to include this because it's already done. And this is a great example that University of Florida has prepared. Just real quick, my takeaways for our audience is to customize that countywide or citywide historic resource inventory. Like Angela already mentioned, communicate and collaborate locally, regionally, and at the state levels. And also integrate your preservation program with your local emergency management and resiliency offices. We've got to be doing that in historic preservation, and we're working hard to do that here in Pinellas County. So thank you very much. Back to you, Lisa.
And appreciate your mentioning the integration of plans, because that's what I may be talking about next, is the effort to integrate planning. Tom spoke about mitigation planning. In Florida, local mitigation strategies are the approach to how we create greater resilience and adaptation, particularly for our historic resources. As we heard, they are recognized as critical assets. And this is something also I would point to the state of Maryland as well as to the state of Massachusetts, which are now realizing that in local planning efforts, it's important to incorporate all cultural values, cultural sites, and historic sites. So mitigation strategy or plan is required if you're to receive federal mitigation grants. If you have historic resources mentioned in your hazard mitigation plan as in need of adaptation or planning for both an event and recovery from events, then you have a hook into the federal and state funding that is provided towards preservation planning and towards disaster resilience and climate planning. So they are updated every 5 years, those hazard mitigation plans. And that planning really looks at 5 different approaches. It's a mitigation plan. That's the planning framework within which historic preservation would fit in planning for climate and disaster resilience. But it is truly, for us, we adapt our resources, because too often mitigation is looked at as perhaps even an issue of demolition or relocation. And obviously we work as hard as we can to develop a means to adapt to future conditions. So natural resource protection is one way to look at it, how we're using nature-based strategies, how we're looking at means to restore natural environments that may be part of an environmental setting for a significant cultural, archaeological, or historic site. There are structural projects. Structural projects are the things we most commonly think about: seawalls, even large berms that are created. Property protection is really where it comes down to what are we doing to that individual property? Are we elevating it? Are we flood proofing it? Are we creating other types of barriers that can keep water away from that particular site? Public education and awareness is where we all can start. Simple steps, creating more information, getting it out there during Preservation Month or during National Preparedness Month in September, or just prior, usually Hurricane Awareness Month or week, whatever the case may be in May. And then prevention. What are we doing at the policy level to make it easier to ensure that we are creating policies, codes, that are sympathetic to historic resources, but at the same time moving towards adaptation. This was something that Angela mentioned earlier. So regional partnerships, resiliency partnerships and cooperation. Happening to work in the Tampa Bay area, we reviewed as part of some of our work for Tarpon Springs, the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition. We pulled this information out of their plan. The whole point of this collaboration effort is to secure increased levels of federal funding to support what are regional infrastructure improvements, adaptation and mitigation programs. And as Angela also mentioned, understanding the needs of properties and the local economies to better prepare for these major events. So Tom spoke about Pinellas's local mitigation strategy. I've got a QR code, though. If you'd like to take a more detailed look, you can actually snap an image of that with your camera while I'm chatting and hold it for future review. But in essence, the LMS, the local mitigation strategy for Pinellas County, did give us a roadmap in Tarpon Springs, as he mentioned, for the work that we are doing there. So as you can see, it addresses the issue of what must be done in Pinellas from different aspects, even including the benefits associated with planning by looking at vulnerable areas, creating a one-stop shop to identify how people, buildings, and infrastructure are exposed to hazards. Again, a lot of public awareness, looking at the floodplain management plan, updating that. This creates an opportunity as well, having a plan to reduce your flood insurance premiums. I can't underscore that more. Something called a community rating system, which we could do an entire presentation on, or not. But every time your community does something to reduce risk, it is also reducing the cost of insurance to property owners. And in essence, developing a blueprint for a consistent, focused course of action moving forward to reduce disaster impacts. So what's Tarpon Springs been doing? So within the local mitigation strategy for the community of Tarpon Springs, which my firm was fortunate to be working with the University of Florida to develop an adaptation and resilience plan, we looked at what was already underway, what projects were anticipated, some funded, some not funded. But these are the items that were in there. And just as Angela referred to the fact that there is work underway in the historic districts in Fort Lauderdale, there is actually prioritization and project planning, if not already funded, projects underway in the historic areas of Tarpon Springs. So we can never eliminate the fact that they're not, we can never say that things aren't being done in the historic districts to improve the chances of those properties better sustaining floodwaters in the case of a hurricane. It's just that they're not necessarily doing it because they are in a historic district. So we really need to ensure that when these flooding adaptation strategies are developed, that we have front and center as preservationists those places in our communities where we know that tourists come, where there is a bottom line benefit of historic preservation, and where we know residents have a great need to protect their historic irreplaceable assets. So Tarpon Springs, Florida, it is a self-proclaimed world center for the sponging industry. The Greek community in establishing that area really put their mark on Tarpon Springs, a wonderful community. Shrimpers later came on. The African-American community is well represented. There is a Greektown Historic District, which is a National Register traditional cultural property. It is tied to the Greek community, and the resources are valued as much for their cultural expressions and the stories, as Tom referred to earlier, as the architectural character. The Tarpon Springs is the National Register and the locally designated historic district. And we were fortunate to start working in the Union Academy neighborhood, an African-American community, learning more about their resources, identifying those areas and properties that should be individually landmarked locally, if not necessarily National Register qualified. It is a heritage tourism-based economy. It has increasing threats from flooding and high wind, and of course, as we heard earlier, also experiences its own share of nuisance or sunny day flooding. These are the types of assets that are there in the community. They are simple historic resources tied with the people that established the community, as well as the industry, the sponging industry. So you can see they're fairly modest. We have a little bit of mid-century modern, as you can see in the image to the far bottom left. And we also have the sponge docks, the commercial storefronts along the Greektown Historic District, and some of the sponge warehouses. Also, I'd mention, though not shown here, is some of the sponging boats are actually National Register listed. So we have maritime assets as well that must be protected. We are looking at assessing the vulnerability. We've completed that. We researched past disasters. We identified the specific hazard-prone areas, also including Union Academy, the African-American community. We did a lot of public engagement, and then through that, we developed preservation priorities and recommended adaptation strategies. So the adaptation and resilience planning goals are outlined here. The building to the left is actually now City Hall, but was the Tarpon Springs High School. The planning goals are such: support disaster adaptation for properties, launch a public awareness and education program, amend the existing policies and establish new ones that would promote resilience in historic areas, not just the districts, but within areas that have been determined to be important to Greek and African-American history. Develop some guidance. We developed a toolkit for disaster risk reduction. Promote the GIS data collection on vulnerable historic resources, and then document the culturally significant properties of the African-American community within the flood risk areas of Tarpon Springs. Now, we also looked at other communities that are dealing with regional cooperation and looked at examples that are in the state of Florida. This is really moving us towards dealing with a project in Fort Lauderdale. So in terms of prevention, which we refer to as policy, it's land use planning is one of those items in prevention. We looked at the public policy advocacy goals for Southeast Florida, the regional compact, because again, if we were doing work in Broward County or in the city of Fort Lauderdale, we're going to look at regional issues that incorporated the needs of that community within a larger planning effort. So the planning provisions for these jurisdictions include coordination of the activities between local governments, looking at and incorporating the analysis of climate change and sea level rise in a regional way to identify risk. What are some of the infrastructure decisions that need to be made that have the greatest value? And do we need to look at relocation of infrastructure in order to support greater resilience in specific areas, such as Fort Lauderdale and Miami-Dade County? looking at future development and density increases so that they could reduce the footprint and the growth in those areas that are prone to flood risk. And then finally, again, adaptation action areas, a terrific tool and overlay to look at to help prioritize the resilience issues. When we came in to start working with Fort Lauderdale to develop their first preservation plan, it was based on what had been identified in the recently completed Fort Lauderdale Comprehensive Plan. And we were specifically looking at resilience, which had been identified. This was really how we began this work in Fort Lauderdale, was we needed to look at the resilience goals and objectives, the issues of what are the existing environmental conditions, what are the priorities for resilience, what are the economic and development impacts. And then we also went to another objective, intergovernmental coordination, because it's extremely important for our federal and state preservation agencies to be working with their counterparts in developing these disaster management plans for historic assets. So in coordinating at the federal and state level down to the county level for disaster redevelopment. And interestingly enough, disaster redevelopment plans after a disaster, how are we going to look at how we redevelop in those historic areas? Specifically in Fort Lauderdale, we had some key resources at risk. The Stranahan House, which you see there in the image, is a much visited historic site. The Himarshi Historic District and the Sailboat Bend Historic District, both designated local districts, and then 8 individually designated historic landmarks. So the preservation plan was drafted with a resilience goal to increase the resilience of historic properties and cultural resources to better withstand the threat of flooding and climate-related disasters, with a survey goal of conducting flood vulnerability assessments of contributing properties, those had not been done yet, in the established historic districts, and for any individually designated historic landmarks. That gave us some priority. Again, this came from what the community told us were the priorities for survey. A policy goal and incentive objective was to promote the use of tax incentives, existing tax incentives in the state of Florida, and with the national or with the federal rehabilitation tax credit, and to explore the creation of a new local tax incentive for improvements, any improvements to properties that could reduce historic property flood risk. The other thing we talked about were some examples from other communities. There are a lot of other policy approaches to preventing extreme damage to historic properties and reducing flood risk. So looking at green infrastructure as a way to protect historic places that would be more a mitigation strategy approach, even more so than adaptation, but even things like rain gardens, the simple things that we hear about frequently, or green roofs. But another innovative idea that came out of Boston is this future conditions checklist. So when you come in for newer substantial improvements to properties, whether it's infill or substantially improving a historic asset, anticipate what future flooding is going to be and plan your project based on that. Another approach in historic rehabilitation is the adaptation strategy. Basically, look at your floodplain management ordinance and recommend changes that encourage resource adaptation rather than an exemption or exception, that is, to having to meet any of those requirements of reducing risk to properties in historic districts. Perhaps requiring a phase 1 archaeological survey for substantial excavation that takes place as part of an elevation or relocation of a building. Develop review procedures for building elevation, not just the guidelines, which fortunately the National Park Service has developed those adaptation guidelines for rehabilitation when you're looking at reducing flooding, but really look at the means by which your procedures are in place to consider those adaptation measures. And then finally, work now with historic property district homeowners and commercial property owners to craft future criteria for any mitigation and adaptation activities that could impact historic resources. When you plan ahead, if you are talking about a post-disaster development strategy, it may involve buyouts, it may involve relocation, or it may involve future easements. Work with communities now to decide those important issues before disasters strike. And then prevention. Some of the best practices available in Florida. I would encourage anyone from any state to look at our adaptation planning for historic properties, as well as disaster planning for historic resources. And then its own approach at the local level is being taken by a number of communities: Apalachicola, Fort Lauderdale, Nassau County, Palm Beach County, Sarasota County, St. Augustine, and Tarpon Springs, as you heard today, also have ways to incorporate hazard mitigation planning into preservation plans, or vice versa, preservation into other type of planning efforts. But begin with public awareness and education. It is a simple approach. Bring in a noteworthy speaker. This happens to have been John Englander when I was in Annapolis. He is an oceanographer and author on issues of sea level rise and climate impacts. He spoke at our local rock radio station really about this issue to a group of younger individuals. Obviously, they are the future. So we need a media or communications campaign to be able to roll out information. But there's also some simple things that are funded by FEMA. This High Watermark Initiative program actually allows you to post interpretive signs. You can be creative with developing those interpretive signs and talk about the history of flooding and photos of flooding in your community in the past. So this is a means by which you can not only educate your residents, but educate visitors to the area about what is at risk through a FEMA-funded grant program. And then our takeaways. In total, you've heard it time and time again, integrate all local and state climate or disaster planning efforts to include hazard risk reduction for historic and cultural resources. You need to assess the vulnerability of your properties from all the hazards, not just flooding, but also looking at tornadoes, looking at earthquakes, looking at the drought or wildfire situations in your community. You can do this through reconnaissance, survey work you're doing, and through flood mapping. You can seek funding for planning, survey, and adaptation, not just from your Historic Preservation Office, but also from funding that is available for hazard mitigation work through your state and federal level. But do remember, it must be in a local plan. Your projects, your planning efforts must be identified in your local plans before you can go to those state and federal sources. Use recognized planning tools. Don't start from scratch. Use the basics that are already in your community. If you have a resilience plan, a comp plan, if you have an adaptation plan, a climate action plan, a preservation plan, use those basics to incorporate historic culture and cultural resources. And then again, start with building partnerships and regional collaboration. Those will not only develop agency to agency agreements and priorities, they will also set you up for funding sources that may be available that you weren't aware of. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers and to let you know all of our contact information. We're happy to follow up with questions, but also after the conference, after PastForward, feel free to contact Angela, Tom, or I at any time. Thank you for tuning in on this recorded effort. And if there's any questions we can answer, we'll be available to do so. Thank you.